First, I thought I'd make a kind of general remark about how developmental psychology is broad, multifaceted, and quite diverse. You can see developmental psychologists studying anything from infant brain structures to the life stories of the elderly, from parent-child interactions in a family context to peer interactions on the playground. And it's because of this diversity that you see developmental psychologists draw quite heavily from many other disciplines such as education, sociology, linguistics, biology, neuroscience, economics, philosophy, and even theology, as we'll see in just a moment in the talk that I'm going to give. So what you'll get with me and with Grace and with Arlene, the other presenters, is kind of a snapshot of this diversity as it's represented in our department at Simon Fraser University. My graduate student, Stuart, Hammond, and I are going to present what was probably a overly ambitious talk, The Origins of Morality. We thought we'd, well, Stuart might be up to this. He actually has an MA in philosophy, so he could probably discuss this better than I can. But we thought that we would change our title slightly to The Good, the Brain, and the Cuddly. And that's a picture of my son Quinn at 3 months there. And by way of a quick overview, morality is commonly associated with religion or spirituality, so it's not surprising that many people would believe that the origin of morality is in some divine source or some supernatural source. In the sciences, both in the biological sciences and in the social sciences, however, the impulse is to naturalize rather than supernatural, to naturalize morality. That is to show how morality emerges through natural processes, be they biological processes or social processes in nature. So some of the most recent work in psychology has focused on the neurological or brain structures that are implicated in moral reasoning, and we'll talk a little bit about that in just a moment. But just in terms of an overview here, we're going to break the talk into divine, biological, or really neurological, and social interactional approaches. Although I'll be critical of all of these at some level, in the end, Stuart and I will come to a kind of synthesis, or at least argue that if you're going to study morality as a science, that you have to take a multifaceted approach. There's just too many keyboards up here to push, Richard. It's not just the arrows you're So morality, particularly within what I'm calling the divine approach, is associated with compliance to rules. Rules given to us by authority figures, be it God or other worldly leaders of some kind. Common to this view is the notion that moral rules or principles are part of the very fabric of the universe. That is, moral rules like rocks or tables or chairs are material things, and they exist as separate entities apart from human interactions or social arrangements or social routines of some kind. This view is sometimes referred to as moral realism. On this particular approach, moral rules are discovered or revealed, perhaps. Something like you might discover DNA or the genetic code in a laboratory. And interestingly, this approach isn't too far off from what neuroscientists are attempting to do now in contemporary work, but without this divine or supernatural aspect. So, following a path that was set out in the mid-1800s by Charles Darwin, among others, many contemporary psychologists have begun to explore the evolution of the human brain in an attempt to isolate the neurological substrates, the brain structures, responsible for human morality. The top diagram here is the brain, a drawing of the brain of a macaque monkey, one of our closest evolutionary relatives. The red area highlights a part of the premotor and primary motor cortex, where recently a significant discovery was made by a group of Italian researchers regarding a set of nerve cells, or neurons, found there. These cells are called mirror neurons because they are activated both when an action is actually performed and when it is simply observed in some other person, as if the observer themselves were performing the action. Now, in the macaque, these cells have been located, and there's evidence in human brains that there's a similar mirror system that's located, as you can see, also in a kind of similar area in the primary motor cortex. These neurons have been argued to be the root of human ability to imitate others' behavior, including and especially moral behavior, and the experience of empathy, which is arguably one of the most important factors in the experience of moral emotions like guilt or shame. Pushing this approach a little bit further, we see very recent work by Dr. Mark Hauser, who's at Harvard. He's a language researcher and an evolutionary psychologist. And he's claiming that our brains are essentially hardwired to be moral. Here, innate morality means that we are essentially born with all that we need to be moral creatures. Now, evidence for this comes in a variety of forms. Perhaps the most famous case is actually a more behavioral evidence of a man named Phineas Gage, who suffered quite a severe brain trauma when a railroad spike went essentially through his cheek and up through the top of his skull. He lived, and actually there's some humorous plays about this and things like that, but the real case was quite unfortunate. He went from being a very upstanding citizen to a kind of misfit and moral scoundrel. And the argument, as the argument goes, it's that the particular brain regions that were damaged by that railroad spike somehow formed the center of his moral organ or moral faculty. Other evidence, slightly different, can be seen in the behavior of psychopaths who obviously, because of the characterization of psychopath, engage in a variety of deviant and often immoral kinds of behavior. Nevertheless, many psychopaths perform at the same level as typical people do when it comes to moral reasoning tasks. So a little bit later, Stuart's going to mention the work of Lawrence Kohlberg. Psychopaths seem to perform similarly on the kinds of measures that Lawrence Kohlberg had developed to test moral reasoning in typically developing individuals. So all of this has led to a kind of series of studies, mostly brain imaging studies, that are attempting to target the neurological structures activated when people are engaged in moral reasoning. Now comes perhaps the fun part, at least for me. I want to argue that the biological neurological approach tends to overlook that morality is a social phenomenon emerging from interactions between people. It's a social phenomenon not unlike, I would say, many games are social phenomenons like football or basketball or just about any game imaginable. That is, just like in games, we have rules that are meant to guide our behavior in the context of the game. Well, morality is like a system of rules that guides our behavior in society more broadly, right? So this opens up, I think, the question, let me back up a little bit. If then morality is a bit like a game, why aren't we, for instance, looking for something like the football lobe of the brain? So the work on that biologists and neuroscientists do, not to somehow diminish it, But simply I want to say here that they seem to be neglecting the fact that morality is itself a social phenomenon. And if we were going to extend this argument even further, we would be doing things like looking for the football lobe, which this is from one of my Sports Illustrated magazines. I'm a bit of a football fanatic, or actually a basketball fanatic. So this opens, I think, up the question of how should morality be studied in psychology? If not turning to the biological or neurological sciences, well, where should we turn to? Right? And now one possibility, developed in fact by one of the founding fathers of developmental psychology, Jean Piaget, is to study children's game interactions, or the interactions of children in games. And at this point, I'm going to turn my mic over to my colleague Stuart.
That there's a bit of a problem with studying, as Bryan was saying, there are very good reasons to look at morality and through a neurological lens, but there are some problems as well. One of them is that, you can probably think about this occurring in your own lifespan, is that morality can change over time. And I would think certainly our attitudes towards the environment, over a longer span towards women, in terms of stereotypes, racial and otherwise, these have all changed very rapidly. So this is a reason for thinking that perhaps morality isn't locked into the brain, but can be negotiated and reasoned and expanded over time. Now, Jean Piaget was a Swiss psychologist, and he called himself a genetic epistemologist. Genetic in the sense of looking at the origins of knowledge, was epistemology. And he started studying morality and the understanding of morality in children through the use of marbles. And he thought that games were a good avenue to look at morality because, on the one hand, games have rules, so very much like traditional morality. But on the other hand, games are something that we can, through social interaction, negotiate and change over time. So there's a nice kind of fit there with morality. What Jean Piaget found was that very young children understood the rules of the game, if you asked them about rules of marbles, as external and unchangeable. So they had something like the moral realism that was mentioned earlier. They thought, so for example, he asked a young boy, well, when your father played marbles when he was a kid, was it the same rules? And the boy answered, well, that actually in his father's time, and since the time of Jesus, people have played marbles the same way. Okay, so obviously this kid has the idea that the rules of marbles are eternal, been around forever. Children then start to learn that rules are something that is personal and negotiable between people. So an older boy asked, well, did your dad play marbles this way when he was young? And he recognizes, well, no, they probably had other rules. An implication of all of this is that you can imagine with a young kid, if you ask them if they want to change the rules, well, let's do it this way, you can imagine how they might react. So they'll see it as maybe a form of cheating or a violation. A younger kid is able to negotiate and to accept changes in rules. Okay. So as children learn that rules are negotiable, they begin to turn less often to parents or to teachers on the playground, and often to their peers to hash things out. And Piaget found that children were able to almost create a kind of democracy on the playground. They were able to negotiate a form of equality and fairness in their games. So Piaget was actually very optimistic about children's morality. And at the time, he actually began to feel that parents were a bit of a constraint on the development of children's morality. Now, this was him working in the 30s, very strict parenting. I think parenting styles have changed, and he would acknowledge that with a democratic parenting style, you could also develop this kind of sense of equality and fairness. But he really thought that kids could develop this with each other on their own. Following Piaget, a researcher named Lawrence Kohlberg observed that the circle of morality begins to widen. So initially, we may be fair, we may be democratic, but we're going to only restrict that kind of fairness to our friends, our family. That gradually, as we develop morally, we begin to widen that out to more distant friends, maybe classmates, and finally strangers in our moral decision making. Okay. Now, these two researchers had a very optimistic view of kids, but the reality is there are also lots of problems. The most severe of these is bullying. I'm sure that if I had everyone here raised their hand if they've ever felt bullied for how they look, how they've dressed, something like that at school, I'm sure everyone would probably put up their hand. And unfortunately, if I asked if you've ever bothered somebody with the way they look, the way they act, I think a lot of people would put up their hand as well. So bullying is a really big problem. Bullying can involve both physical and relational aggression. So physical is kind of the classical bullying, pushing people, etc. Relational aggression is a form of social aggression, excluding people, making fun of them, names. We can imagine how physical aggression is very harmful, but really a lot of researchers now showing that relational aggression is just as terrible. And there have been some pretty awful cases in BC of people being led to suicide, etc., through this kind of relational aggression and exclusion. And unfortunately as well, as new arenas open up technologically, there are new avenues for bullying. So the new one is called cyberbullying, using the internet or text messaging to bully. But an important thing to realize, and this is something else that's come out of research, is it's not just the case that we have bullies and victims. There are also bystanders and interveners. And it can be really difficult if you're in a classroom situation to imagine how to change a bully. But it's a little more possible to imagine how you could teach someone who's a bystander, someone who's watching someone being bullied. And that's often the case in the playground. There's other kids around watching what's happening. What you want to do, the goal of moral education, is then to turn those bystanders into people who will take a step forward and intervene. So I'm going to talk about one of these programs. A new trend in education, which is very much based on the research that's going on in moral psychology, is called social emotional learning. There's lots of different programs. I'll talk about one. It's called the Roots of Empathy. It's an evidence-based program. And this is sort of like what you would do with drug trials. You actually go and you test them in a controlled way to see if they're effective. So increasingly, intervention programs in schools are tested this way. And we're testing to see, are they effective? Are they improving children's behavior? The Roots of Empathy program is a program that brings an infant and their caregivers and an instructor into the classroom over 9 months. And I've had the opportunity through my graduate work at SFU to actually be a Roots of Empathy instructor for the year. The children are all very excited to meet the baby when it comes to the classroom, but really it's kind of a trick. What we're doing with the Roots of Empathy program is when the baby's in the classroom, the baby's very young, baby can't talk, baby can only communicate through its face, through crying. And we use that as a lever to start getting the kids to recognize emotions, to start recognizing, making them very attentive. Well, what's the baby feeling right now? Why is he crying? So we get them to think about those things, and we gradually try and get them to think about their friends and peers. And it's thought, through the Roots of Empathy program and other programs that are like this, that teaching children to understand, to recognize emotion, and to communicate about these emotions is going to be a really important part of reducing bullying and a big part of the goal of moral psychology. So we've mentioned we're taking at SFU a more social approach to morality. Now you can see here, this might be the actual Roots of Empathy with these babies reaching out to each other. Now, one interesting possibility is to see something that is actually biologically based, and that's that when we're born, compared to other mammals, we have a really long period of relative helplessness. That's called neoteny. It sets us up to be extremely reliant on others. We have to really learn to watch and observe and communicate with others. And it might be that sort of early experience of being helpless, of being reliant on others, of really having to observe others, that sets us up for our later moral emotions and experiences. So it might be these early experiences that promote brain changes, so things like the development of mirror neurons, this period of relative helplessness. From those early experiences, those are nurtured and developed through education. We'll have some time for some questions after this. A real controversial point in moral education is, what do you teach? I mean, I think everyone here would agree that trying to reduce bullying is a good thing. But other than that, some people have some genuine qualms about bringing morality into the classrooms, in part because of those ties to religion in the past. In part, people have disagreements. Maybe it's an imposition of culture or otherwise. So it's a real question what we bring into the classroom. So I'll close with a quote from John Dewey, who is an American psychologist, teacher, and philosopher. So he saw moral science as not something as a separate province. So it's not something just theological. It's physical, biological, and historic knowledge placed in a humane context where it will illuminate and guide human activities. So moral science isn't something that is linked to this theology. It's not strictly biology. It's something, what we're trying to argue, something that blends all of these together. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
We've got time for a few questions while we're transitioning for either of our speakers. You get Bill Donahue, so you get Jenny. Any questions?
Could you comment briefly on the outcome of the social emotional learning program that you'd mentioned?
Okay. Well, so the outcome of the research or my own personal experiences with it?
They saw a reduction in bullying.
Right. So what usually happens with these programs is initially what teachers report anyway. So this is being done in hundreds of classrooms across Canada. But initially teachers will actually notice an increase in bullying. But usually what that is they're now more aware of it, and students are more aware of it as well. They're catching more bullying. So it's not necessarily the case that it's more is happening, just everyone is more sensitized to it. The research has shown that generally over a school year, aggression will increase. Classes that receive the Roots of Empathy program, for example, that won't occur, so that those aggression levels won't increase over the year. The evidence-based nature of this program is really, the research is just still in pretty initial stages. Our lab is actually now testing the program in preschool classes. Early signs are it's doing something, and one of those things is at least stemming off that increase in aggression over the year in the school.
Any other questions? Jenny?
Hi. I was just wondering, what age infants do you use for the Roots of Empathy program?
The babies have to be between 2 and 4 months in October. So unfortunately, a lot of parents who would like to be part of it, their kid's born at the wrong time. It doesn't work out.
My son was.
Your son was?
My son was. My daughter went to Ready, Set, Learn in July, and they asked me to bring my son in. And yeah, he's a little bit too old.
A little bit too old, yeah. You know, and as I was saying, part of the goal of this is to have the babies there when they're quite helpless and really not capable of doing much, and seeing over the year them develop. So that's why they want them a little bit young, yeah.
You don't leave them alone, right?
Oh, no, they're, no. Yeah.
One more?
How long are the babies in the classroom?
A big part of the program is actually teaching the kids that we have to respect babies. Even though they can't say a lot, we really watch them. And actually, as instructors in this, we basically follow that rule. So I've had good days where the baby's been there for 40 minutes, but there have been days where I've said after 15, okay, I think baby wants to leave right now. So yeah, it's pretty open.
Thanks, Stuart.